My name is Gilbert F. or Fred Jordan. I moved to the Ozarks back in 1984. I had lived in the past in places like Colorado, Utah, Minnesota, California. I've lived in Europe. I visited, I guess, about over 30 to 40 countries in the world, so I'm well traveled. I speak 4 foreign languages fluently. As far as education is concerned, I have an education in both business administration. I have an education in engineering, specifically metallurgical, ceramic engineering, and industrial engineering. And I have degrees also in physics and so on. Like I say, specifically my universities that I have attended, people can check this out. I've been to, let's say, Colorado School of Mines, University of Utah, Brigham Young University. I have been at the University of Maryland. I've been at, I've even graduated from a local college, Missouri State University. I have attended Max Planck Institute, and I have from Camden University and the University of Manchester in England. I also have degrees. I have doctorate degrees, I have master's degrees, and I have bachelor's and AA degrees. So I guess from a standpoint of formal educations, I do have a pretty extensive background in various fields. My interest presently, of course, is I'm always learning. I'm trying to get away from just the physical sciences. I am doing some studying in areas of ecology, environmental science, biology, and I'm also broadening my interest into subjects like folklore and related subjects. So I'm always interested in learning from that standpoint. As far as my work experience is concerned, I would say that the last 45 or more, 50 years of work experience that I have, probably 3/4 of that work experience has been somewhat tied to the government in one way or another. I've done, yes, commercial work. I worked as geophysicist and geophysicist for companies like Pan American Petroleum Corporation. I've worked for a lot of government contractors over the years. I've worked for companies like Martin Marietta Corporation, Honeywell, Univac Corporation, Litton Corporation, and ITT, Gilfillan, and I've worked for numerous government agencies over the years in various capacities. I've done civil service with, for instance, Edwards Air Force Base, and I have been involved with all kinds of work. Some of the work that I've done has been highly classified. Right at the onset, I'm going to make this disclaimer that I'm not going to say anything on television or on the air or so that's recorded that can't be verified from some secondary source. That means that either on the internet or somewhere else, what I will be saying or talking about, even though I may have experienced it, somebody else has also experienced the same, and somebody somewhere has written or talked about it. And so all I'm doing is verifying what some other people may have said, and I may be a catalyst in kind of tying a few strings and kind of putting some of these things together in a what do you call it, more coherent manner, which would be understandable to an interested audience. I'm sure some of the subjects I'm going to bring up are going to be of interest to the people who are viewing this. I'm going to start out with UFOism as a subject. It's a loaded subject. I find out from surveys that approximately 67% of Americans do believe that there is something to the UFO phenomena. Even though the Condon report came out, and I talked to E.U. Condon back in the early 60s, before he came out with his, in the late 60s, with his Condon report. I went to Boulder and talked to him, and this is what E.U. Condon said. He had already a bias as far as UFOs are concerned. He said, we're being paid by the Air Force to do this study, so we're going to give the Air Force what they want to hear. So with that ado, I'm going to proceed and say that I at first was very skeptical. With my upbringing, I thought that all UFO phenomena was basically probably natural phenomena, or that it was misinterpreted events by the observers, or that it was could be marsh gas, swamp gas, ball lightning, that it could have been aircraft that people have seen that didn't understand or misinterpreted, that it could be something that military or that our governments manufactured, and that was my original beliefs. But as things went along, I was shown at a base in Utah. We were working on, at that time, on some weapon program where we could actually, it was, at the time, it was a very top secret program, but it's interesting that on Aviation Week magazine, a few weeks after the event, they published that a drone aircraft had been shot down by a pencil of light, which from a laser weapon. Well, it is true. We did create a laser-like weapon which shot down a drone aircraft that had been launched when Wendover, and our equipment was located out at close to Dugway Proving Ground. Now, Dugway Proving Ground, for all information sake, is quite an extensive place. They had one time the longest runway in the world. It was even longer than the one at Groom Lake or the one at Edwards Air Force Base. They have several runways out there presently. They have also all the capabilities there to launch space vehicles, just like Cape Canaveral or at Vandenberg. There's many government agencies out there, as well as there's university experiments. They're doing things such as the Fly's Eye, or High Resolution Fly's Eye experiment, which is to look for cosmic rays. They have an array of mirrored objects where they look for cosmic rays. They were involved with the Genesis and Stardust program, where they were recovering missions where they had sent out probes that would collect dust both between the Earth and the Sun, and the second one was going out between us and the asteroid belt and further, and they brought back and they were analyzing the dust that was collected from those probes. So there's been both peaceful as well as military things accomplished at the Dugway Proving Ground, but in days in the past, Dugway Proving Ground was used for chemical, biological, and radiological warfare. I'm using the term radiological rather than nuclear because radiological is a broader term, which would of course include everything from Bug Rogers type radiation type weapons to nuclear weapons. So they have done all kinds of work out there. Of course, people read about the sheep incidents and the dealing with biological weapons and stuff like anthrax, and that there were nerve gas, like they use VX and sarin and all kinds of nasty stuff out there by Granite Mountain. Well, that's not the only place where I've been. Obviously, Edwards Air Force Base, Detachment 3, which we were all a part of, and so on, did run for the both for the Air Force and the CIA. We ran what is known as the Groom Lake facility, or we call it Area 51, which was the part of the designated AEC facility where they tested approximately 800 nuclear weapons, both ones that were underground as well as above ground weapons. So if you were to look at the seismicity, and I was involved with a study involving that, the seismicity in the Nevada area has been considerably changed since they started setting off nuclear explosions in that area, and especially in the Frenchman's Flat area. And of course, they did nuclear rocket programs out there at Jackass Flats. And of course, you can go from Mercury, Nevada through the Jackass Flats area at the AEC facility, which now is a Department of Energy facility. And you can go on to Groom Lake, which of course was created. There was an old mine called the Groom Mine, and near Rachel, and in that area of Kelly Johnson, they wanted to go ahead and deal with creating reconnaissance aircraft. For instance, the U-2 was used, by Powers and originally for getting photographic reconnaissance information, and the reconnaissance information that he was trying to gather, you remember he was shot down by the Russians. So Kelly Johnson wanted to have a craft that could fly higher and faster, that could outrun any of the SAM missiles that the Russians would shoot. So therefore, they created the A-12, which was a single-seater version, and that basically was a reconnaissance craft, but there were other versions of that were tested of that craft to be high-speed intercept craft, as well as that later on evolved into crafts such as the SR-71. Well, some of the companies I worked for, like Univac and Honeywell, we designed, and I was part of the teams that helped design the computers for various crafts, such as the B-1 bombers and B-2 bombers, the SR-71 and other things. I've been involved, of course, over the years with these government contractors and with the different Department of Defense agencies in dealing with weapons development and computer development. And as a result, I got in on knowledge of many interesting things. The reason why I brought up Dugway Proving Ground and also Area 51 is that there's lots of folklore, if I would call it, or a lot of rumors, and people wonder what's going on out there. And they talk about, some people say, well, there's little aliens running around and all that type of thing. Well, if there are aliens running around in any of those places, then they must look very much like you or me, because I surely didn't see anything that strange when I was in those facilities. But I do know that there's considerable facilities. Like at one of the locations, there's over 27 levels underground, and they have considerable money invested in those facilities. At the one facility, I had two generals that I was dealing with. I won't mention their names at this point, but we had developed a weapon that could shoot down a drone aircraft, and they wanted to know whether we could actually shoot down Russian missiles. And we said, yeah. How long, they asked us, before we could develop it to the point where it not only shoot down aircraft, but could be used as a weapon for, let's say, shooting down a Russian missile. And at that time, this was back in the 60s, well, actually, it was 1970, around 1972, between 68 and 72, that we said it'd probably take about 3 or 4 years for us to develop a weapon where we could shoot down a missile. So using a missile to shoot down a missile is not very effective, since we have other technologies which are much more efficient and can do the job cheaper and better. And these technologies do exist. The other thing I might mention is that they asked a question then, what about shooting down UFOs that go over our airspace? And that's when we wondered, what's this all about? And then it was opened up to me that, yes, there are concerns. In fact, I might mention this as a fact even today. Even though they say that they are not actively looking into airspace or UFOs or so on, well, that's absolutely a lie, because the government is very interested in anything that could be a challenge in flying over their airspace. There are still manuals in the Air Force and other places that they have orders that if an object over our airspace does not properly identify itself, does not meet certain specifications, they have standing orders to shoot it down. So at this point, there is admission, you know what I mean, that we are concerned if there's anything that is of that nature. And if we do shoot down a UFO or have shot down UFOs, naturally we would try to get the crash remains, and we would try to, what we call, study them and reverse engineer them. The same thing applies to these so-called crashes of so-called UFOs. There's been crashes of UFOs. I know of at least 26 crash sites over the years here all over the not only the United States, but in Russia, China, other countries. And most of the governments of these countries have all been involved in looking at the crash sites and carting off the crafts and looking at the reverse engineering. The thing I might mention is that we have had several crashes right close here to the area where we're at right now is Cape Girardeau. And Cape Girardeau had a crash back in 1943. It was before Roswell. And what did the government do? They did, as Courceau says in his book, The Day After Roswell, but he refers specifically to Roswell, says that we reverse engineered the technology from those crashes, and we got computer technology, fiber optics, and other advanced technology from the crashes. Well, long before that, there was crashes like over in Bavaria. There's been crashes in the Czech Republic. This is all on the internet. I have relatives in the Czech Republic that actually saw the Nazis back in the late 30s carting under a tarp a craft and taking it, you know what I mean, in the direction of Prague to be studied by the Nazis, so they could go ahead and the Horten brothers and the Messerschmitt and Junkers could go ahead and reverse engineer and come up with German technology that would possibly be based upon this foreign, some call it alien technology, from the crash that took place over in the Czech area, or the Czech Republic, and near Poland, actually. And the other crash that was in Bavaria, there was one there too, and the Nazis got involved with that. And there is documentation where they did actually get quite advanced and it may have been possibly responsible for what we call the Foo Fighters that the British were talking about during World War II. Now, it's interesting. This goes directly to my getting back to Dugway Proving Ground and when I was talking to the generals, and we had developed these, laser weapons to bring down not only drone aircrafts, but later on Russian missiles and possibly even UFOs, which if we shot UFOs down, we could then reverse engineer the technology and use it for our own benefit in our own defense or whatever. There is a paranoia among some people who are in government. There are good people in government, there's people that have their own agendas, there's an atheistic element in government that is afraid of whatever they cannot control, what they don't understand and can't control, they are fearful of it. And I'm, being of a religious background, that doesn't bother me. I believe in a God that's God of the universe, and I would say basically that it doesn't bother me if there are aliens out there, so be it. You know what I mean? They would have to abide by the same laws the rest of us have to, and report to the same God if you want to look at it. So it doesn't cause me any anxiety to believe in UFOs. But at one time, you know, I was concerned. But then I was surprised when the story was told to me that in a time in Denmark, there was a crash. That apparently over Germany, a British Spitfire was flying, and it spotted one of these Foo Fighters. They thought maybe it was a German experiment or craft, maybe possibly manufactured by Messerschmitt or Junkers. But anyhow, what it did is it ejected a shaped charge-like object, and it caused the Spitfire to crash. Well, this is the first time I ever heard. Up to that time, I had already interviewed with E.U. Condon, and I had talked to UFO people and so on, and I had never heard of an offensive encounter with a UFO. I never heard of anybody that would, that harmed anybody. I never heard of a UFO being a threat. Well, all of a sudden, these two generals that convert us that there could be a possible threat involved said, well, there was this UFO or a Foo Fighter, whatever it is, that shot down a Spitfire, and then they recovered the craft, and in the craft was an object which was about that long, and the analysis showed it was made out of an aluminum silica alloy, and it was very top secret. We were told to keep this top secret for many years. Well, it isn't until many years later that it was brought to my attention that on TV here in the Ozarks, on KY3, Tony Beeson was announcing that there was a Museum of the Unexplained and a Bob White, that he had in 1985 gone ahead and was taking a trip with a friend going from near the Grand Junction area in Colorado. He was on the way to go to Las Vegas through Utah, and he was going to go past the Green River facility. Now, Green River one time was a launch site for Pershing missiles and Athena missiles. The Athenas were used in a reentry program where we were studying reentry of missiles, and they would shoot the Athenas for the Air Force, but they were made out of aluminum, but not the same aluminum that is found in the Bob White object or in the Denmark objects and so on. But they would shoot from Green River. They would launch these Athenas, and they would go and be launched to White Sands. Later on, the Pershings, which also I might mention, the Pershings helped bring an end to the war with Russia, the Cold War, because we bankrupted them and we surrounded them with Pershing missiles all over Europe, which carried nuclear warheads, and we started coming up with a anti-missile program. And so, of course, I met Gorbachev on occasion and other people, and there was a negotiation with Reagan and Gorbachev, and that, of course, brought an end to the Cold War. Well, I will say that the Pershing missile was one of the systems that helped bring an end to the Cold War, because the Russians were outgunned. Well, the Pershings were launched out of Green River when they were tested to White Sands, at least the Pershing 1s. Later on, the Pershing 2s were launched from another site that was up in Idaho, which was another sub-base to White Sands. Well, the alloys that are associated with a Pershing missile and the alloys with the Athenas do not match the object of Bob White or the analysis of the object recovered during World War II over Denmark. These objects are rather unique. In shape and so on. People can go on the internet and look up Bob White object and see pictures of the object, and it is interesting that right now the object might end up being attested of Bob White's. But let me go back to the object originally that the government recovered. It was top secret that they had that. Nobody ever talked about it, and I kind of forgot about the object until that it was sitting in the vaults of originally it was in the vaults of the Brits. And then the Brits turned it over to our government. And I will say that through the Freedom of Information Act, the Fort Belvoir website released what is rather poor picture or poor quality pictures of the object that was recovered from, and it says on there, object recovered from a flying saucer over Denmark. So this is from the government Fort Belvoir files. Well, I handled that object, or at least if it wasn't that object, it was one like it. But it is kind of a coincidence that the two generals told me that the object I handled came from the shooting down of what happened in Denmark. And it's interesting that the Fort Belvoir side comes out and says that they're releasing photos, you know what I mean, of the object from Denmark, which ejected from a UFO, which brought down a Spitfire. So it was an offensive weapon of some sort. Well, Bob White's object, I'm not going to go into his whole story. You can get that on the internet and other places, but short, I'm just going to make this statement that he was in 1985 making his trip at night going towards Green River, and he sees this object near a railroad track that paralleled the highway at that time, and it was about the size of, he says, approximately a very large two-story barn. And it was sitting there, and he kind of snuck up on it and got close to a ways, and then all of a sudden it shot up, and it united with what I would call a kind of a almost cigar-shaped or a cylindrical-shaped object that was, according to his story, up in the air. And after it had joined, it shot down almost like a warning shot or something in his direction. So Bob White, and he's had actually, before he died, he had a couple of lie detector tests given, and he passed them with flying colors. And he also had a witness that saw the object. But for many years, being an entertainer and thinking that he would be labeled as a crackpot, he didn't come forward with it. When he finally did come forward, spent all his money, went broke, and he's now dead, and his widow is being challenged, her property on some kind of a state or county suit. They're trying to take it all out on the widow, and as a result, she might be forced to sell the object. Well, before that object gets sold, and so on, here is a thing that just came to me from Dr. Gibbons, who had worked one time for NASA and for Lytton and so on. Dr. Gibbons is a physicist. He said, this was sent to me by email on April 19th, 2010, subject Chris McIsaac's IAR tests. I forwarded Chris McIsaac's last email to me back to him today, pointing out that he said he would do the chromium IAR tests on Bob White's object the first week of May, which is just 2 weeks away. I reminded him that I promised Bob on his deathbed that Chris would do the tests, and asked Chris for a good mailing address where we can send a sample. They cut off a sample from the object, and we will see what he says. Well, I hope that Chris McIsaac will finally do this chromium abundance test, because it's an isotope abundance test, that there are certain chromium isotopes that only occur in outer space, coming from, and only can be created in an outer space situation. And the chromium that we find on Earth is a different isotopes, and so on. So that should, once and for all, there have been all kinds of tests done on the Bob White object, but if this test is done, it should once and for all settle it, the whole question whether it comes from an extraterrestrial, what I call manufactured, extraterrestrial vehicle or device, or if it is actually another possibility, reverse engineering. Because I earlier mentioned that there have been crashes, and that our government and other governments have reverse engineered technology that they have gained from crashes. And the other question is, could that technology have been responsible for some government thing? But I'll say one thing: some people have come and suggested that it was that he saw it during the time of Athena or of Pershing tests. Well, from my knowledge, they didn't launch in 1985 any Pershings or any Athenas anymore. The last tests of some of those missiles were the early 80s or the late 70s. So I would say that we have a unique hard evidence here of UFOism, and I thought I'd bring that particularly up of the government, or certain elements in government don't want the people to know that there may be something out there. And the paranoia that is there is they're going to try to cover up any hard evidence, that, if at all possible. So I've mentioned two situations. One is Cape Girardeau here in Missouri, where there was an actual crash. Right now, up until 2000, you could actually see where the crash occurred. You could go over with an aircraft, and Ryan Wood on the internet, and his father, who is a physicist and an engineer, worked for McDonnell Douglas, Robert Wood, have looked into the crash at Cape Girardeau, and they've looked into Roswell crashes along with Stan Friedman, and so they've looked into that end of it. And so that opens up that there's more to the UFO question than what most people have been told. I'm going to just mention a few things about government cover-up. Going back to 1964, when I was working at Martin Marietta Corporation, we had to work on making the Cheyenne Mountain help make it bomb-proof against a direct strike from a nuclear weapon. So I can't go too much into that, other than if you go back to Peter Jennings when he was airing a bit about the Cheyenne Mountain, and he was allowed to visit Cheyenne Mountain. And I might note that the general that was involved with Cheyenne Mountain got the hand slapped after the interview. But anyhow, they took a tour of it, and I was surprised that they kind of showed the way that we achieved making the place with a shock absorbing mechanisms, making it bomb proof. You know what I mean, against a nuclear blast. I was surprised that was shown on PBS and on some main stations. Also, I saw that they did show the flat screen televisions and small, everything they had. They showed an awful lot of it. But you know, people, when they watch Stargate or other science fiction things, they can see the entrance to Cheyenne Mountain. But Cheyenne Mountain has got basically the same design that other facilities, like the site that was built, we call it the hotel, or the R site, which goes back to Eisenhower, where they would have a shadow government that would operate in emergency of a nuclear attack. They had essentially a city underground, which was, and of course, right now on April Fool's Day, it comes out on a supposedly the White House's website, invitation for people to go and be able to spend time at Camp David and go through the tunnel that connects with Raven Mountain site, and they can see, of course, Raven Mountain, and that is now being used more for collection of data collection, you know, like microfilm, and they keep books, or I should say everything on semiconductor disks and other storage media and so on, because there is a bigger and better facility that replaces, like I say, what we call the hotel. And I call it the hotel because there were actually parties held up above, you know what I mean? There was a secret entrance into it, and there was a place up above which people could actually dance and actually stay in the hotel and enjoy themselves. Did not know that there was a section where the government could operate from that was underground. Well, that was connected through a tunnel, and that tunnel ends up at also at Camp David. And if you look at the entrance of that tunnel, it looks just like the entrance of the Cheyenne Mountain. So it looks like with the openness program that President Obama is coming forth with, he's trying to say, okay, we're going to open up Camp Davis to those who are willing to come and pay the price under certain stipulated conditions. And they're trying to open some things to us and that, but obviously they're not going to open up everything. Because like when I was at Cheyenne Mountain back in 1964, I saw flat screen television, which would cover the wall behind you and so on. We didn't know of flat screen television, and at least the public at large didn't know about it until around 1992, 1993. So I'm saying is the military is what, anywhere from 40 to 60 years ahead in technology of anything that the public at large can even comprehend. We, in many respects, have already far exceeded anything that you can imagine from science fiction. We've exceeded many things in science fiction. Well, an example, of course, is look at my son is on a nuclear submarine right now, and it is better than the submarine that, you know, the Nautilus, you know, I mean, that the science fiction writers talked about. So, yes, we've exceeded science fiction in many ways. And I'm going to bring up something now that Obama just announced. You remember under President, I was wondering how we were going to get around this problem, because we say we left the moon in 71. Remember, they say that in 1969 was the first time we landed on the moon, and then there's people today that don't even think we ever landed on the moon. They think that's all hogwash. Well, if it's hogwash, then I shouldn't be here. I was part of the Apollo program. Apollo program was a program set up by President Eisenhower as a competitive propaganda public program to compete with the Russians' public program. But you got to also realize that the government always has parallel programs. They'll have their secret programs as well as their propaganda programs where the black monies go. And we've always had other programs than the Apollo program. And the Russians, besides having their Cosmodrome program and what they do to go up to the space station. By the way, the space station, which was kind of, originally there was the Freedom Space Station that was mentioned by President Reagan. Well, President Reagan's Freedom's station was later on came into this what we call the space station we have that everybody's using with the Japanese and the Russians and us. Let's face it, when the Russian space station came down, you know, and burned up, and we all send up our what I call obsolete space shuttle program. The space shuttle program is, like I say, is based upon technology we have in the military. It is unnecessary duplication. In fact, it's obsolete. It should be retired. They're old, they're unsafe, and that public space station up there, yeah, it's up there. If other nations want to use it and they want to open it up to private enterprise to go up there, fine and dandy. But the military has their own platforms. They have their own space stations, and they have their own reconnaissance stuff. And it's interesting, the Russians intercepted, and they published on the internet for many years, until just quite recently, they had intercepted the original discussions from Armstrong landed on the moon, and he said, hey, we're being watched. Somebody else is here on the moon. And that was on the internet published. And so who else was on the moon before Armstrong? Well, I'll put it this way. The United States was already up on the moon back in 1963. We already had programs going. And what were we looking at on the moon? Well, if you go and read the works of Sitchin, Zachariah Sitchin, and I'm not going to, people read a lot of stuff from Van Daniken. Van Daniken raises a lot of good questions, but he doesn't do good science. At least Zachariah Sitchin is versed in many languages, and he does things such as studying the Sumerians, the Babylonians, and the cuneiform records, and so on. And he goes into pre-flood eras, and you know that we have a lot of history that goes back to, they talk about Atlantis, and they talk about India, and they talk about flying carpets, flying machines. Well, people can go to the museums in Peru and other places, and they can find that there were toys that they found made out of metal that resembled our jet aircraft and some of our rocket ships of today. So what I'm trying to say is that we're not the first civilization that's very advanced on this planet. There are older civilizations that have been on this planet that had high technology. There's I call it the A mechanism that comes from that was fished in the Mediterranean off of Greece. This mechanism basically it was an analog computer. quite advanced, and it goes back many hundreds of years before we had analog computers. I saw a computer in a museum that actually in Persia when I was able to go into Iran, and it predated this computer device predated Christ by almost 2,000 years. So I'm saying is there is almost in every culture a story of a great flood, and that there's something that took place. But what happened? What predated the flood? Now we're getting into the area of speculation, but I think it's worth at least mentioning it for what it's worth, is that mankind got very advanced, supposedly, and maybe we got ourselves spanked in a way. We got too haughty. According to, if you take biblical accounts and other historical accounts, man got so advanced that they thought they were little gods, and trying to be conquerors and whatever. Well, and they had many battles. It's interesting that talking about battles, there is a particular material called tritonite. It's named after the site Trinidite, after Trinity. If you go to Trinity, that's where the first atomic bomb was let off. And I have samples at home of tritonite that come from the original site. I've also picked up tritonite that was taken from Frenchman's Flat. Now, whenever an atomic bomb goes off, it lets off it fuses the sand or the soil, and that what faces the bomb is fused and has an interesting character to it. And that what faces away from the blast has a different appearance. And in most cases, this material is kind of a greenish amber or a greenish color. And tritonite can only be found around where there is an atomic explosion. And I have seen it from Frenchman's Flat, and I have seen it from the Trinity site, and like I say, I have samples in my rock collection. And the thing about this material, and why I'm bringing it up, is that this material is different than if you have lightning striking sand, and I have some of those fumarole type materials. It fuses and has a certain signature, has a certain mineral character to it. So if lightning strikes sand, it fuses it in a certain manner. If you have tektites or have meteorites, and I have those in my collection, the tektites, which are caused, let's say you have a meteorite hitting or something that splashes on the moon and throws off a hot splash of glass-like material that later on cools. This forms a material called a tektite. Well, I have tektites that come from Czechoslovakia, and some that I collected there, and some that I've collected when I've been in Vietnam. And that material, even though it's fused, looks a lot different than lightning strikes and sands, and it looks a lot different than this trinitite material that is around an atomic explosion. Now, why did I bring up this subject? It ties into this thing about wars and advancement of humankind that may predate the flood. What I'm trying to make comment about is that we have found, I was in Lebanon and in the Sinai Desert, and I know some people that have gone to India. And we've picked up samples of this trinitite. And this trinidite can only be found where there is an atomic explosion. You can't form it with lasers. You can't form it from lightning bolts. It is not formed naturally from these meteorite offshoots, which we call tektites. It has a signature. It has its own characteristics. And there's only one way a trinidite can be formed is from a nuclear explosion. And we have found evidence of this material found in various parts of the Near East and also over in India. And they've even found trinidite down in South America. Now, I'm not going to give you the sites. People can have fun, go on the internet and go other places and find where these places were, where they found the material. So somebody was more advanced than we are today, and they had nuclear weapons. And apparently it predated the flood. So, what does this all have to do with what I'm leading up to? Well, did we have space flight? Did we have the capability of getting off this planet predating the flood? People like Sitchin and myself and others, Hoagland, other scientists think that's quite possible. Maybe we got to think that we were little gods, so to speak. And did we go to the moon? Did we go to the Mars? Or did aliens come here and so on? Well, what do we find up on the moon? Hoagland has lots of material on the internet. You can look at it. And my wife and I have gone through all the stuff that was sent from NASA Langley. Some of it they say has disappeared. The old original stuff that was part of the Apollo program. Well, my wife and I went through the Ames library. We went through a lot of this photographic material, the stuff that Hoagland was looking for. Well, I and my wife have actually handled this stuff and looked at it. And I'm not going to say if I strabised somehow some of it or not. I'm not going to say anything. There may be something locked away in a vault somewhere where I may have some copies of some of this stuff. Quite possibly. I don't want to get myself into trouble, so I'll just say that, Hoagland is, what he's brought up, he's done a good job of research. I'll say this as being an insider. And having seen the original Apollo findings and known some of the original astronauts and talked to Irvin and others who looked at antiquities on the moon. The question is, who put it there, these antiquities, these structures? Were there earthlings, people from our Earth that put them there? Or were there people from aliens, that built them there and used the moon as a intermediary spaceport or something? We don't know the answer to that question. I don't think there's a person today who knows the answer to that question. So I'm saying, but they're there. Well, people are afraid of letting people know the truth that there's something up there. And we didn't want the Russians, we didn't want to let the people know up there why we went to the moon. By the way, I'm going to talk about going to the moon. The Germans, part of their, they had their V1, V2, and they had their A12 and their other programs. They had actually built an ICBM-sized thing where they actually put on top of it a V2. They actually, the Germans got advanced enough. They didn't build very many of them, but they actually launched a couple of astronauts back in World War II to the moon on a non-return flight. They were supposed to go to the moon and photograph it and get close to it because Hitler believed in, all these, he was given a lot of, what do you call it, tales. He believed in the Holy Grail, and he believed in a lot of things like the Ark of the Covenant, and Hitler wanted to develop Nazi science, you know what I mean, to get into these areas. And so they did attempt on a no-return flight. They already, in World War II days, tried to shoot for the moon. Now, von Braun was part of that program. Von Braun came over here, and guess what happened? Von Braun was recruited with his scientists into more than one program. There was the Apollo program, which he was a part of, and if you look at the number of Apollos that were, we call about Saturn ones that were manufactured, and if we take the number of Saturn V's that were manufactured, if we take the number they used in the public Apollo program, count them up.
For all the fun, take us here, and you take us there. And it is just because you really care.